There was a moment earlier this week, right around dinner time in my house, when my 8-year-old daughter was feeling a little overwhelmed by the amount of homework that she had. Between that, play rehearsal, dance class, she let out a very loud, very sweet exhale and said something that I know every parent has heard before. You don't understand how hard it is to be a kid. It's so much easier being a grown-up. And as much as I tried to comfort her, I had to hold back my laughter. Later that night, after I went out for a synagogue meeting, I came home, looked at the stack of bills that my wife and I had to go through and pay. I looked at my wife and said, I wish I was an 8-year-old. I mentioned this because I think that's human nature, for us to look at others, focus on how much easier somebody else has it, because we tend to focus on our hardships and only our hardships. There's a short section at the very end of this morning's Torah reading, Parashat Vayera, that our bat mitzvah beautifully chanted, that seems to have nothing to do with the narrative. A lot happens in Parashat Vayera. We learned about Abraham arguing with God to spare Sodom and Gomorrah. We have a second account. For the second time, Abraham convinces his wife to pretend she's his sister to spare him from a king. We have Abraham kicking out Ishmael and Hagar, with Abraham almost sacrificing his son Isaac. A lot happens. And then at the very end, the Parsha tells us that Abraham is informed about what happened with his brother Nahor, who seemingly he hadn't heard from since we last heard from him, the very end of Parshat Noach, when it says that Nahor and his wife Milcah remain in Ur Kasdim, and they don't travel with Terach and Avraham and Sarai and Lot on this journey. So what happens? Abraham is informed that Nahor and Milcah gave birth to Utz and Buz and Kemuel and Chesed and Chazo and Pildash and Yidlaf and Betuel. And in addition, with his maidservant Reuma, Nahor has additional children, Tevach, Gacham, Tachash, Macha. Now, some commentators suggest that this is meant to connect one parsha to the other. That Abraham's desire next week to find a spouse for Isaac, seemingly he would look to his extended family, and if Rebekah is Betuel's daughter, then Betuel needs to be introduced at the very end of this parsha, and it's solely to connect one narrative to the next. But I think these seemingly throwaway verses about family lineage suggest something greater. As a reader, it's easy for us to read about Abraham's life experience, the traveling, the wandering, the struggle to have children, the difficult relationship between Sarah and Hagar, and then the severed relationships between Ishmael, almost murdering his son Isaac, and think solely of tumult, struggle, pain, and suffering. And then imagine Abraham when experiencing that and being told of his brother Nahor, who he hasn't kept in touch with, who we haven't heard from in weeks. And as he struggled and Sarah struggled to have a child, well, Nahor and Milcah, they had Utz and Buz and Kemuel and Chesed and Chazo and Pildash and Yidlaf and Betuel. We don't know anything else about them, but in these couple of verses, it seems that the challenges Abraham experienced, his brother did not. That life always seems greener on the other side. That's human nature. For children that may be more materialistic, how come they have that new toy and I don't? Or the latest device? Or for teenagers, those trendy clothes that are fashionable? For adults, it's wondering, why do we have to struggle with illness, with financial straits, with fear of our own safety, when from a distance, that may not seem to be the case for others? And don't get me wrong, I say this with an immense amount of privilege, because there are those around us that are struggling. As I mentioned earlier, be it because they're furloughed, because of the shutdown of the government, or withholding of SNAP benefits, or because they fear their own safety, with ICE officers kidnapping people off the streets, even in our own town. So don't misunderstand what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say that the struggle people face is not real. It is. What I'm trying to say is that sometimes we need to check our privilege when we feel our struggle, when there are those who are struggling. But what I'm also suggesting is that our default as human beings is to only focus on our struggle, to only focus on our pain and our suffering. Maybe that makes sense for Abraham. He comes from a place of fear. Midrash suggests that the reason that he and his family left Ur Kasdim was because of pain and suffering. Nimrod threw him into a cauldron of fire. It was no longer safe for him to live there, and he had to flee. And he feared for his own safety, even at the expense of his wife. We see 2 accounts of him lying about who Sarah is because he's worried he would be killed as a result. He's so worried all the time. Coming from a place of fear, it's easy to yearn for what is seemingly easy, what seems like his brother Nahor has. But what happens when we live a life of fear? We forget to live a life of love. As much as Abraham and Sarah went through, the Torah never says that they loved each other. We're only introduced to that idea next week with Isaac and Rebekah. Because hate, I would say, is not the opposite of love. Fear is the opposite of love. And so when Abraham lives his life of fear, he can't find opportunities to love his wife, love his children, and then he can't find opportunities for joy. The Mishnah famously teaches us, Eze hu ashir sameach becholko. Who is rich? One who's happy with their portion. When fear consumes us, there's no room left to appreciate the blessings that we already have. Joy ultimately comes from focusing on those blessings, what we have, and not thinking about what others have that we don't. Last week, as Abraham began his Lech Lecha journey, God promised Abraham the Hibracha, that you should be a blessing. And we're left wondering, why does our patriarch need to be told that he will be a blessing? And some of our commentators conclude it's because he needed to be reminded of the blessings that he had. He's told this from God because he has this dream in which he says, where is my lineage? Where is my legacy? I don't have any children, God. What will I make of my life? Because according to the Torah, that was what was so important to him. He was focusing on what he didn't have rather than what he did. Sometimes certainly I do, but we all need to course correct and be reminded of the blessings that we have instead of focusing on that which consumes us, that which we struggle with, that which we may lack that others have. Sometimes with reasons all around us to be fearful and angry and upset, it's easy to forget about those blessings, which is why we need to be reminded, which is why the Torah tells us that it was human instinct for Abraham to focus on what his brother had that he did not, instead of focusing on the blessings that he in fact had. And what we have, in spite of what we lack, then, God willing, we could live a life with less fear, less anxiety, less anger, and with more love, and with more joy.